Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining the Surrey Board of Trade this morning. I'm Annette Huberman. I'm CEO of Surrey City Building Business Organization. I'm also an honorary captain of the Royal Canadian Navy, appointed by Canada's National Defence Minister. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the treaty territory of the Tsawwassen First Nations and the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Kwantlen, Katzie, and Semiahmoo First Nations. I'd also like to recognize that we are on the land where we live and work for the Inuit and Métis peoples as well. Events like this simply do not happen without sponsorship support. Thank you so much to our co-presenting sponsors, Rogers Communications Canada Incorporated and the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. Thank you so much also to our Business and International Trade Center sponsors. They are the law firm of Fasken, the Chambers of Commerce Group Insurance Plan represented by S&F Benefits, BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada, and Scotiabank. Thank you so much for your support. If you're starting a business, if you need global business connections or trade documentation services, or any type of business support, visit our Business and International Trade Center. We are now open for in-person service. I'd also like to recognize with us on the call are some government representatives. Dan Albus, Member of Parliament for Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola. Tamara Jansen, Member of Parliament for Cloverdale, Langley City. Nellie Shin, Member of Parliament for Port Moody, Coquitlam. Representing Trevor Halford, MLA for Surrey White Rock, is Effie Cerise, and City of Surrey Councillor Stephen Pettigrew. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us this morning. Just some instructions before we begin. All attendees are muted. If you do have a question, please put it in the chat function of the technology, and we will get to it during the question period. If we're unable to get to your question, we'll get the answer to you by email after the session is over. Ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, Surrey is going to be the largest city in British Columbia by 2030. And the Surrey Board of Trade, we're one of the top 10 largest chambers of commerce, boards of trades in Canada. There's 450 of us that are supporting business, bringing business into the city. We're one of 9 organizations that sit on the Premier's Economic Recovery Task Force, identifying gaps and opportunities during the pandemic. And we also have a direct line into the Prime Minister's office to do the same. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome our co-presenting sponsor to say a few words. Thank you so much again for your support to Rogers for Business. Please help me welcome Rick Sellers, President for the BC region for Rogers. Rick, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anita, and good morning, everybody. I'd like to start by thanking the Surrey Board of Trade for hosting today's event. Rogers is a proud member of the Surrey Board of Trade, and we share their vision of helping local businesses thrive and actively contribute to the growth of BC's economy. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Today, I'd like to talk to you about our commitment and support to building a stronger economy, both in BC and across Canada. In 2019, Rogers launched a multi-year plan to enhance wireless services in preparation to launch 5G nationwide, and also in response to a growing public demand for connectivity. As one of Canada's largest and fastest growing communities in BC, Surrey residents of more than 500,000 are now key recipients of our Rogers investments. This represents millions of dollars on building new wireless installations to support the city's fast expanding growth with 5G services and expanding our fiber footprint. Rogers is now Canada's largest 5G network, live in over 70 communities in BC, 170 across Canada, including right here in Surrey. Rogers now employs 1,700 people in British Columbia, and we just opened a new solution center in Kelowna, where we plan to hire another 350 people by the end of this year. Lastly, we invested over $4 million in community initiatives. This includes grants and funding for youth and local communities to support education and business development. As one of Canada's top employers, we're very excited for today's session with the Honourable Ed Fast to reflect on Canada's economic success, I should say, and outlook for the future. With that, I'll hand it back over to Anita.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for your support. And as mentioned, Rogers has been an amazing partner for the Surrey Board of Trade, and telecommunications, like never before, is so important as we continue to do business even beyond the pandemic. And now I'd like to welcome our co-presenting sponsor from the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, so invested, so committed to our great city of Surrey, the Chief Financial Officer for the port, Mr. Victor Pang. Victor, over to you.
Thank you, Anita, and the Surrey Board of Trade for the wonderful work that you do and for hosting the event today. I'd like to first by acknowledging the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples on whose ancestral lands I'm speaking from today, and I want to extend my thanks to them. I'm really happy and excited to be here today to be part of this important conversation about Canada's economic success. Surrey is a very important part of the port, as many businesses in Surrey are users of the port or an integral part of the overall supply chain for the port. As many of you know, over the last year and a half, the supply chain in Canada and around the world has seen different types of challenges. And that includes the very recent fires that devastated the community of Lytton and the disruption to rail traffic as a result of it. So first of all, I'd like to express our thoughts are with the community of Lytton and with families impacted by the wildfires. Safety is a very paramount issue for the port. And as a port authority, we support the steps that are being taken right now to ensure that the residents of Lytton and surrounding communities feel safe. We're currently working closely with Transport Canada and our supply chain partners to assess and address the impact of movement to goods. And we really appreciate the hard work and dedication of all of our supply chain partners, including longshore labor, the terminals, railways, truck drivers, and many others, and some of which reside in Surrey. It is through their collaborative efforts working with us and each other that has really allowed the port to stay resilient throughout the challenges throughout the last year and a half. In 2020, through the pandemic, the port saw trade volume grow, not a lot, but still 1%. But if we looked at different sectors, the grain sector had record year in 2020 and grew a staggering growth of 24%. And this year, as the pandemic recovers, the container sector has seen some historical monthly volumes, which is quite amazing. So if we look at it broadly, as we look ahead at the overall economic recovery for Canada through the pandemic, we'll continue to make sure that we make the critical investments here at the port to ensure that we have adequate capacity for future growth. For example, we're currently investing approximately $1 billion in road and rail infrastructure across the Lower Mainland. And these investments, along with other things we're doing, will play an important role in generating economic activities in the region and supporting good paying jobs for families and businesses in local communities like Surrey. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce today's keynote speaker, the Honorable Ed Fast. Ed was first elected to the House of Commons in 2006 and re-elected 4 times, the latest of which in 2019. He previously served 2 terms as an Abbotsford School Trustee and 3 times as a member of the Abbotsford City Council. On May 18th of 2011, he served as International Trade Minister under the Harper government, became Canada's longest serving trade minister. A graduate of UBC, he practiced corporate and commercial law in Abbotsford for more than 24 years. With that, please join me to welcome Canada's finance critic, the Honourable Ed Fast.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Victor, and to both you and to Anita and to the Board of Trade. Thank you for inviting me to provide perhaps a bit of a counterpoint as to Canada's uh, economy, where we have positioned ourselves as a country financially, fiscally. But I did want to also begin by just acknowledging the tragedy in Lytton, BC, and the hundreds that have lost their homes, they've lost their businesses, and so much more. And I would be remiss also if I didn't acknowledge the tragedy which happened in Kelowna as well, the crane tragedy and all the grieving families. And my heart goes out to all of them. So let me talk a little bit about where Canada stands right now. And I'm going to focus primarily on the recently tabled budget, which was, of course, 1 year late. Typically, Canada has a federal budget at least once a year. This is the first time in Canadian history that a government didn't table a budget in 2020 and waited a year later to table a budget, which was in spring of this year. That budget was the biggest spending budget in Canada's history by a mile. And former Deputy Finance Minister and Clerk of the Privy Council, Kevin Lynch, called it the greatest transfer of intergenerational risk and debt in our country's history. Now, that should be a sobering statement that should wake up all of us. The budget spent in the order of $500 billion after the government spent even more than that the previous year to address the COVID pandemic. And by the way, I do not criticize the government for doing its best to address the challenges that workers at businesses across Canada faced and the investments that were made in emergency support programs. We have spoken out publicly and supported many of them. Sadly, the design of some of those programs was exceedingly poor and has undermined our recovery. The budget revealed that the deficit for last year was $453 billion, far beyond what Justin Trudeau had said he was going to run in terms of budget deficits. He said they'd be small budget deficits of $10 billion. And of course, COVID hit. We understand why those deficits would have to be temporarily be larger. The problem is the budget signals interminable deficits going forward. In fact, we had asked the finance minister time and time again in the House of Commons, can you tell us when you plan to return to balanced budgets? Is it short term? Probably not. Is it medium term? Probably not. Is it long term? Somewhere in the distant future, do we have a balanced budget? They refused to answer. Then we said, do you have any plan to balance the budget at any time in the future? And we asked that question again and again. There was no response. I would just point all of you to the parliamentary budget officer who came out with his report to parliamentarians on this budget, where he clearly said there is no plan to return to balanced budgets. The debt that this budget will generate probably go up to about 1.4 trillion. The number that was officially in the budget was 1.2 plus something. But in fact, we expect the debt will mount to about $1.4 trillion by the time this year is done. And you should all know that the government also in its fall economic statement passed a law that increased Canada's debt ceiling from 1.1 trillion to 1.8 trillion. When we asked the government, where's that extra $400 billion going to be spent? Like, what's it for? They said, oh, don't worry about it. We have no intention of spending that money. It's just in case, just in case. Well, the government blew through its last debt ceiling, and we fully expect that it is going to blow through the next one as well. The budget does not contain a defensible debt management plan. The best they could do was to signal a trajectory that at some point in time, the debt to GDP ratio might hit around 50%, which is up from 30% pre-pandemic. So There are no firm targets that the government set for its debt management plan. There are no clear fiscal anchors, no targets. And then the budget included that $100 billion stimulus program. Now, we were led to believe that the stimulus program would be used to stimulate the economy. It would make investments in areas that would stimulate long-term growth. For example, things like Victor mentioned, infrastructure, roads, bridges, port expansion. In fact, this $100 billion was actually used for additional emergency support measures, as well as a fire hose spray of spending intended, of course, to re-elect a Liberal government in the fall. The Parliamentary Budget Officer referred to this spending, the stimulus program, as miscalibrated. In other words, it was unnecessary to inject this additional taxpayer money into the economy because the economy was already growing at a pretty good clip. And there's also somewhere in the order of $200 billion of savings sitting on the sidelines, household savings, and probably another $200 billion in corporate savings waiting to be re-injected into the economy as it reopens. So many economists have suggested that there was no need for this stimulus. And in fact, the stimulus was converted from being stimulus to a plan to dole out election goodies. The Parliamentary Budget Officer also suggested that the stimulus money could have been used to reduce the deficit. The government declined to do so. And of course, there are the inflationary pressures which stimulus injects into the economy. And if you were going to ask me, what is the biggest risk to our economy? I would suggest to you it is inflation, and then the interest rates increases that follow inflation as the central bank tries to control inflationary pressures. There are two views on what the current inflationary pressures mean for Canada. Quite a number of economists believe that inflation is transitory, that it is a time-limited phenomenon for right now, that in a year or two, the inflationary pressures will be gone. I believe that's the view of the Fed in the United States as well, the Federal Reserve. Now, the Deutsche Bank in Germany, arguably the preeminent bank in Europe, has a completely different perspective. They referred to a ticking inflation time bomb. And I believe it behooves all of us to at least take note that there is a very real possibility that the inflationary pressures that we are experiencing today portend a greater calamity coming forward if, in fact, governments don't rein in their spending. And I say that because it's not only the $100 billion of stimulus that the federal government in Canada has spent. In the United States, those of you who follow what's happening there, they introduced a $2 trillion stimulus program, which sent out, millions of checks across America. They then introduced an infrastructure program worth another $2 trillion, and then followed that up with a family plan, Joe Biden's family plan, which also is worth about $2 trillion. So you add all of that up, that's about $6 trillion of stimulus that is expected to be pumped into the North American economy. And with that kind of cash sloshing around, that sloshes over our border, it impacts us, and likely will generate significant inflationary pressures. We're already seeing the cost of living in Canada go up significantly. Of course, housing is a different animal altogether. We already had housing unaffordability in Canada before the pandemic. Now that more stimulus is being pumped into the economy, it's exacerbating that situation. The housing bubble still doesn't look like it's going to burst anytime soon. And that hurts young families across Canada that had the hope of living in a Canada where they could afford their own home. And now they see that dream disappearing very quickly. There are some budget positives. I'm just going to highlight three. The childcare program, even though I believe there's going to be an implementation challenge. Remember, this government has promised, or Liberal governments have promised childcare problems on 9 different occasions over the last several decades. They've never actually been able to implement a plan across Canada. I'm hoping that the government will now actually effectively implement a plan that has built into it the flexibility to accommodate the different childcare needs of families across Canada. If it's a one-size-fits-all, Ottawa knows best plan, we're going to be in trouble and the plan is going to fail. And we've shared that concern with the government. We do support the extension of support programs, including the new hiring program, because we do need to get Canadians through the pandemic so that we can get back to some sense of normalcy. There was also a little bit of infrastructure investment in the budget, but not anywhere close to what we would have liked to have seen. Quite frankly, there was an investment on broadband, which is very important for our economy. Canada, as a technologically advanced country, as a highly educated country, needs to connect citizens to the internet. We need to be connected to each other, to businesses around the world. Broadband is one of the key investments we can make. Sadly, the government set aside effectively about $1 billion, which is a drop in the bucket for broadband rollout across Canada, especially to the rural areas that are yet to be serviced or serviced well. Just in comparison, Ontario has 4 times that amount in terms of broadband investment. So for the federal government to actually come up with $1 billion to cover all of the provinces and territories probably will fall short. So what's our solution to this massive financial, I was going to use the term mess, but this financial challenge that is being left behind for future generations to manage? Well, there's 3 ways you can address a massive debt like the one we have amassed. One is you can cut spending dramatically. Of course, that hurts Canadians across Canada who depend on government services. And I'm not advocating massive cuts in spending. You can grow taxes. In other words, increase the tax burden on Canadians, including on small businesses. And I suspect that's probably where the Liberal government would end up going. Or thirdly, you can grow the economy. So one would have expected that this budget, an historic budget in terms of its size, in terms of its scope, and in terms of its opportunity, that this budget would in fact be a growth budget. It would invest in long-term economic growth. It would address some of these structural challenges within our existing economy. Sadly, this was not a growth budget. In fact, the Prime Minister's former top senior economic advisor, Robert Asselin, said the budget doubles down on programs that do not address our innovation shortcomings and have yielded few results to date. And then he said, it's hard to find a coherent growth plan, end quote. And that is a former Liberal economic advisor to this government. This was not a growth budget. You will hear the government say it is. It isn't. Countries like Italy and Germany and Japan and France, the G7 countries, they invested heavily in key things like tax reductions or targeted tax reductions, in massive regulatory reform like they're doing now in Italy. Japan has funded its companies to reorient their trade away from hostile regimes like China to more friendly trading partners. In Canada, we made no investments like that to address structural problems, no plan to address interprovincial trade barriers, no real plan to address regulatory gridlock. So there's no regulatory reform signaled. There's no comprehensive tax reform signaled, and we need that in Canada. There's no grand vision to reorient Canada's trade opportunities to like-minded partners around the world. No broad infrastructure plan as there is in the United States. There's no plan to address the need to recruit talent from around the world. There's no plan to rescind legislation like Bills C-69, C-48, which undermine our ability to build infrastructure, including pipelines. And then there's the broken promise on jobs. We'd been promised that by the end of June, the 1 million jobs that were lost during the pandemic would all have been returned. That was the Prime Minister's solemn promise. We have fallen short of that. So what's the bottom line before we go to questions? Well, we believe a growth strategy is critical. Our Conservatives have actually tabled or introduced a plan, our recovery plan. 2 of the 5 points focus on jobs and the economy, which includes winding down support measures as and when it's possible to do that safely and responsibly, redesigning the remaining programs to make sure that they encourage our workers to get back to work, which is a complaint that many employers have lodged with me, withdrawing stimulus properly, focusing on growth and not spending, securing our country's supply of PPEs, restoring a pandemic threat warning system, the issue of mental health, which affects employers across our country, we believe has to be addressed in conjunction with the provinces. And we believe that should include an employer mental health coverage. And then finally, we also believe that there needs to be a return to balance long term. In other words, we have to return to balanced budgets in the long term to make sure that our fiscal environment is one that doesn't jeopardize the prosperity of future generations of Canadians. And I expect our policy platform that we'll release in the lead up to the election will be more specific as to what that plan will look like. So Anita, I'd be glad to answer a few questions that you might have. And so I'll leave it up to you to lead that discussion.
Thank you, Ed. So there is going to be a federal election. Can you confirm that?
Unfortunately, I'm not the Prime Minister, so I cannot confirm that. But I certainly have my suspicions that everything the Prime Minister has been doing is touring across the country. The spending, the spray of spending that happened in the budget clearly signals that he believes this is the time for him to try to get his majority government. And the sad thing is that he effectively is operating as a majority government already. He has the fealty of the NDP, which has slavishly supported him all the way through over these last year and a half, and would likely do so going forward. So why does he have to go into an election right now? Well, you'd have to ask him, but I'm not going to speak for him.
Fair enough. Certainly, we're all still going through, what the future is going to look like, especially for our business community and our small and medium-sized businesses, even our large businesses that have struggled quite extensively on a variety of measures. And then we're faced with the uncertainty of another federal election and perhaps delays in decision-making that really impact the bottom line productivity of our businesses. I'd like to know what your perspective is, Ed, around borrowing money. And it seems that all levels of government, not only the federal government, they're borrowing money to build infrastructure or to do some type of activity to generate recovery for the economy. What is your perspective of borrowing money at this time, and even at low interest rates, to build capital infrastructure projects?
What is my opinion on that? I am supportive of good borrowing. There is good borrowing and there's bad borrowing. If the borrowing that you undertake leads simply to a wasting of those resources, which of course taxpayers have to pay back. Borrowed money has to be paid back. Where does that come from? It comes from taxpayers. I think Canadians have to really come to grips with that. This is about us. It's about our prosperity. And thank you for raising infrastructure as one of the key elements of your questioning, because I actually had hoped, and in fact, I had asked Minister Freeland, I sent her a letter in which we outlined our asks in the budget, most of which were ignored. But one of those asks was, please come up. If you're going to borrow money, and if you're going to invest broadly in the economy, at least do so responsibly into investments that have long-term consequence, positive consequence for our economy. Infrastructure, key infrastructure is one of those. And that includes transportation infrastructure. As you know, Aaron O'Toole last week announced that he is going to fund the extension of LRT out to Langley, which is, I think, is good news for our region of the country. And that kind of infrastructure, some people will say, well, that's not really infrastructure that drives economic growth, is it? Well, yes, it is, because the more efficient our transportation systems are, the more we can eliminate gridlock within our transportation systems, the more efficient our economy becomes, the more efficient our workers become, and the more efficient our businesses become. So I'm very much supportive of key investments in things like Victor mentioned, in port expansion, in roads, in railway, making sure we're building the bridges required. We know we've got some pinch points within the Greater Vancouver area when it comes to access to our port. I'm keenly aware of those, and I suspect I'll be meeting Duncan Wilson in the coming weeks to discuss these kinds of investments with him as well.
So Ed, you mentioned LRT to Langley. It's actually SkyTrain to Langley.
SkyTrain, yes, that's what I meant to say. Sorry about that.
But certainly, you know, we were advocates of light rail transit, connecting all of Surrey, because you can fit the cities of Vancouver, Richmond, Burnaby into our city limits. And SkyTrain now has doubled in price. You know, was supposed to be 1.3 billion, now almost 4 billion, and who knows how much it's going to cost as the years roll by. And through not a densely populated area of Surrey and Langley. So some are questioning, is it the right infrastructure investment for today, given how the values of residents and businesses are that you want to live, learn, work, and play near, you know, all close together. You don't want to spend 2 hours in traffic. And we're still going to be doing that in Surrey. Even with electric vehicle infrastructure, it's going to increase congestion on the roads. So I'm just wanting to ask your opinion about, you know, wise infrastructure investment decisions. You know, we're borrowing so much money every single week in the form of bonds from the Bank of Canada. And in some cases, we needed to do that to support our businesses. But what's your perspective on wise infrastructure investments moving forward?
Well, I mentioned one of them, and that is connecting Canadians through broadband, better broadband. One of the major weaknesses of our economy and our country is the fact that we don't have sufficient broadband coverage in our rural areas. And you mentioned SkyTrain and whether maybe SkyTrain is the right or wrong investment, and that it would be nice for people to work in the communities in which they live. And I by the way, I fully expect that the incredible sea change that has happened during the pandemic, as more and more Canadians have started working from home and realizing that you can actually make this work. In fact, in many cases can work more efficiently from home. Not in all cases, but in many cases, you can work more efficiently. I have family members that are doing that right now who actually work in the Greater Vancouver area and are now working from home 2 to 3 days a week here in Abbotsford. And so that's an opportunity we have. You can't do that if you don't have proper broadband in place. So that's probably the top investment we could make. You may recall when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister and I was Trade Minister, I was also Minister of the Asia Pacific Gateway, which focused on this region of our country. And Prime Minister Harper set aside at that time $1 billion for Asia Pacific related gateway. And if you speak to our Port Authority and many of the municipalities around our region, they will still remember the fact that we made massive investment for that time into infrastructure, roads, bridges, port expansion that allows us as a country to be more efficient in terms of, say, getting goods to and from market. When we're importing goods, the more efficient we are, the better value we'll get when those goods are sold to us. Conversely, as we look to manufacture goods and sell them around the world, typically these are high value goods that are sold around the world. We want to make sure we can get them to market in a timely way. And if we've got pinch points, if we've got delays, all of that adds up to extra costs that manufacturers have to bear, which makes us less competitive within the global marketplace.
Ed, you said that one of your main concerns as finance critic is inflation. Wages are not keeping up. The gap between the rich and the poor seems to be widening. Are we really supporting the middle class?
I believe the pandemic has exposed a tremendous weakness. You're correct. The gap between the rich and poor has widened. Inflation will simply worsen that. I hope that our current inflationary pressures are not a ticking inflation time bomb, the way the Deutsche Bank's suggested it might be. I hope those inflationary pressures are transitory. I have spoken to the central bank, the Bank of Canada. We've talked about where they believe their policy might be going. And as you know, they make monthly announcements about that. And you did mention the purchasing of government bonds. The central bank did say that it was tapering. It was going to be tapering the purchase from 3 billion to 2 billion a week, which I believe is probably the right thing to do. Although I do believe that the central bank should be independent of government. The government shouldn't interfere in its decision making. We trust them to focus on the inflation targets that they set, which are around the 2% mark. And they are tapering the buying of government bonds, which reduces the amount of stimulus that goes into our economy, hopefully tempering the impact that inflationary pressures will have on Canadian families. But we could get into a whole discussion about the housing market, which I am not sure we have time for. You may want to have my colleague Brad Viss on because he's working on that issue and is hoping to come up with a policy on making life more affordable Canadian families when it comes to housing.
Yes, we've spoken to Brad quite extensively in the past on that subject. I wanted to get your perspective on labor shortages, human capital needs for businesses. It is a prevalent issue that will compromise, has been compromising bottom line productivity when we have an immigration strategy. I believe it's just over 600,000 newcomers expected, international students also in the area of over 400,000. What is your perspective on Canada's immigration strategy to help address our labor needs?
Well, that is a big question, and I'll try to do justice to it. Firstly, let me say you've properly identified another weakness in our economy, and that is it's a huge challenge because the baby boomers are exiting the labor force in Canada, and we face a labor force challenge. There's no doubt about that. There are a number of ways of addressing that. One of the ways is to have a more focused immigration system that places the economic interests of our country at the forefront and is designed around that interest, that economic interest. But there are other ways to address this as well. One is, you mentioned it, international education. It was under the Harper government, and that I, as trade minister, introduced Canada's first international education strategy. And the reason this is important is it's not only that we're attracting talent from around the world to come to Canada, hopefully to stay in Canada, but international education is now becoming a mega billion-dollar industry for universities and all the adjunct industries around that. And I'm pretty excited about the opportunity that Canada has to attract more international students who see Canada as being among the most welcoming countries and also having amongst the best education systems in the world. They come to Canada, and we created a program back between 2006 and 2015, a program under which foreign students that prove themselves, that graduate, that have the right qualifications, can actually apply to immigrate to Canada. They have a stream dedicated to Canadian or foreign university students that have studied here. And this is critical because we are trying to attract the best and the brightest from around the world into a highly technological economy. Because we're highly educated, the kind of trade and services we deliver are focused on that. We are world leaders in many of these areas, and we want to attract the best and the brightest. International education as a formal strategy of the federal government will deliver at least some of the labor force that is required to backfill the baby boomers that are now exiting the labor force.
Ed, one of the things that you mentioned in support of, and we've been advocating for that to the federal government, as well as the provincial government, and even our local government, is a comprehensive tax review. Because certainly there is so much bottom line erosion related to taxes. And I just wanted to ask you, though, what is your perspective on the G7 countries supporting a global tax? And I believe it's mostly on digital companies, but if you can elaborate a little bit on that for our viewers.
Yeah, we actually made a statement about the global minimum tax that the G7 agreed to implement. My major concern is not the merits of a global minimum tax, because a global minimum tax is intended to ensure that companies don't go jurisdiction shopping for the lowest tax jurisdiction. We want them to pay their fair share of tax. So if you're a Canadian company, we don't want you to relocate, technically relocate elsewhere because the taxes are lower there. And we as a G7 came together and agreed that a global minimum tax in principle is great. Our big concern is this. We have seen no details about a GMT. And my big concern is that the United States will bake in its competitive advantages in that global minimum tax. Because if you've got all kinds of exceptions and exemptions to global minimum tax, and I fully expect that each of the G7 countries and any other country that joins this agreement, they're all going to be looking for exceptions for their own economy. Well, we have this tax and this one we really need it because of A, B, C, and D. If you've got that going on, eventually, the United States and other countries will likely outmaneuver and outnegotiate Canada, and we'll end up paying the price again, just as what happened in the NAFTA renegotiation, where I believe we were outplayed, we were outnegotiated, because we willfully went forward to negotiate a new agreement when we didn't have to, and we should have been much more focused in the elements of the new NAFTA, the CUSMA, that we were prepared to negotiate. My fear is that as the GMT is implemented and as more countries join, we'll end up having negotiated a position that is detrimental to our long-term competitive interests as an economy.
Ed, do you think we as Canadians or the Canadian government is focused enough on international shifts of power and how that will impact Canada's economy? For example, China's vision to be the world superpower, to have their own currency, Russia, of a similar light. What's your perspective on that?
Glad you mentioned it. I have been pretty outspoken, if you follow my Facebook posts, on China's efforts to interfere not only in our economy, but to interfere in our political affairs. My fear is that the current government has had a policy of appeasement of China rather than a policy of promoting Canadian values on the global stage. And we've simply acquiesced and we've received nothing for it. The two Michaels are still in prison in China, despite the fact that our Prime Minister has invested $300 million in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which doesn't benefit Canada at all, but is helping build, China's influence within Asia. There are so many different areas that I'm concerned with in terms of our approach to China and other hostile regimes around the world. Canada needs to return to a position where we take strong positions based on our prevailing Canadian values, and that includes on human rights. Why hasn't our federal government spoken out and called out the genocide that is happening to the Uyghur population in Western China? We as a Conservative Party have done that. We passed a motion that would do that, and yet the Prime Minister and his cabinet have refused to acknowledge that this genocide is happening. Why? I believe it's a policy of appeasement that is not in any way delivering value for Canadians.
Ed, I wanted to ask you, there are a variety of political leaders, whether it's locally, provincially, nationally, that are saying that Canada's economy is recovering very well. But from our perspective, when these wage subsidies and other benefit support programs for the pandemic run out, some are running out at the end of September, some are being extended for the hardest hit industries, perhaps. We are going to see some significant shifts on business success. Do you agree?
It depends what you are referring to when you say shifts in business success. If you want to clarify, that's great. I will say this, I am concerned about the design of some of the emergency support programs because quite a number of them are being sunsetted. In one case, of course, being replaced by the new hiring program. But the design of these programs, unfortunately, has encouraged some Canadians to stay at home because the benefits they receive under these emergency support measures, those benefits exceed what they would earn if they went back to work. And employers have been complaining to me about that. And the government is aware of these weaknesses, and I believe those design weaknesses have to be remedied going forward. And of course, as these measures sunset, it's going to force some Canadians to go back to work when they might not want to. We want to make sure that the federal government is fair with workers. We want every single Canadian to be transitioned through the pandemic so that they come out the other side as whole as possible and that we return to some level of normalcy within our economy. And my concern is that the biggest threat to that, as I mentioned earlier, are the inflationary pressures that are starting to percolate because of stimulus that is being pumped into the economy. And we've seen inflation exceed the 2% target that the Bank of Canada sets. But there are some reasons for that. There's the base level effect, the fact that our economy dropped so dramatically in March and April of 2020 and is just recovering now over the last year. You do still see this difference in pricing and wages, in recovery. And once we get back to a more normal level, I'm hoping that we're going to see growth return to a normal level so that we don't have the inflationary pressures that the Deutsche Bank has signaled might actually undermine our recovery.
It's just that some businesses may close down without that wage subsidy, or maybe in the short term, they'll survive, but maybe in the long term they won't. We're trying to figure out ways to really lessen the impact when those benefit programs are removed as a support mechanism. For many, those support programs, some businesses have made money
Yeah.
out of them
Yes. Yes.
and organizations. And so we have to question, what's fair and what our future for our businesses and organizations is going to look like. My last question to
Can I
you.
just respond very quickly? You're absolutely right. The wage subsidy program may have to be extended, especially for the hardest hit industries. For example, tourism and hospitality are arguably the hardest hit industries. They were the first ones to be hit and shut down. They are among the last to recover and reopen. I believe we do need to identify the industries that still need to have government support. So I'm not in any way advocating against the government revisiting the CEWS program to make sure that it still does what we want it to do, which is to get all of our industries through the end of the pandemic and back up on their feet.
My last question to you, Ed, as the finance critic, what's your perspective on addressing specific climate change initiatives to really lessen the impact on businesses, on communities? You've seen the impact within British Columbia, and it's going to continue. What's your perspective on that?
Well, thanks for asking that question. It's an important one because climate change is real, and we as humans do contribute to climate change, and we need to do our part, especially in North America, to help address what is a global problem. And I don't believe hiding behind the fact that we only contribute 1 or 2% to greenhouse gas emissions. That is no argument for us doing nothing. We have to do something, which is why, by the way, our leader Aaron O'Toole released his environment plan recently, which included carbon pricing, but not a carbon tax, not a consumer-based carbon tax. Ours is a program that would make sure that the monies that Canadians pay at the pump, for example, stay within their hands through a carbon savings account. But I would also point to another element of that environment plan, which goes to the heart of your question. How do we address some of the challenges faced by our businesses when it comes to environmental policy, climate change policy? And one of the biggest challenges Canadians have, especially exporters and manufacturers that are exporting products around the world, is that we have such high environmental standards in Canada, and yet we're competing with companies from abroad that are based in countries which have very low environmental standards. How do you level that playing field? And Aaron O'Toole's plan was very clear. We're going to have to impose carbon measures at the border carbon measures, to make sure that any products that come into Canada that compete with Canadian manufacturers are tariffed to the point where they no longer have a competitive advantage over our companies. We have some of the cleanest companies in the world. Even when you look at our oil and gas sector, which is vilified by some, I'm not going to vilify them. I believe they still have something very significant to contribute. And we're not going to get rid of plastics anytime soon. And we need natural gas to make those plastic products. Our oil and gas sector is arguably the cleanest in the world. And there are many other countries around the world that still have robust oil and gas sectors that are not clean at all, that are environmentally polluting. And our footprint, our carbon footprint, is much less than those. We need to make sure that we're competing on a level playing field. Our plan actually will remedy that.
Ed, thank you so much for joining the Surrey Board of Trade this morning. Always a pleasure to hear your perspective on
Likewise.
Canada's economy and all of your previous portfolios as well. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Thank you to our co-presenting sponsors, Rogers Communications Canada and the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. Remember, we have a significant lineup of events even during the summer. Check it all out at businessinsurrey.com.